Update 47 is almost here, and people are still freaking out that they're losing a ton of damage. They don't know whether their build is going to work next patch or what to do about it. And yeah, there are some pretty big changes coming, and some annoying ones too, but hey, the good news is we're all gonna be fine. Trust. This is Khan, you're watching Ninja Pulls, and with Feast of Shadows, aka Update 47, just around the corner, I thought it was time to recap what we know, specifically about combat changes, and specifically from a PvE perspective. Actual build videos are on the way, but I thought we'd start with an overview to quell the panic and let you guys know what you can do to make sure you're still keeping up next patch. Nerd warning, I am gonna dive into some nitty-gritty details, but I'll do my best to keep it real and not get lost in the fine print. Start with the big one, Arcanist Banner. The Arcanist class mastery script is now much weaker, and although the banner still puts a lot of pressure on your resources, perhaps its most attractive characteristic has now gone. That gives us 3 options. 1. Drop the banner. Forget about it entirely, or at least relegate it to a support skill that's just run by 2 people in the trial group, so we can all still get the focus and minor affix buffs, but no free crux and no prophecy and savagery. Your sustain will be so much easier, and you can slot Camouflage Hunter or Grim Focus for prophecy, equip things like Barbed Trap, something to buff your damage passively, or just whatever utilities you need. You might also want to try switching back to Exhausting Fate Carver for slightly more damage, although you might miss that crazy free shield. 2. Keep the banner, but swap the class mastery script for another more useful one. The only real alternative is Cavalier's Charge, which grants 6 weapon and spell damage for every percentage bonus to movement speed that you have. That's up to 324 weapon and spell damage. Not bad, assuming you can still sustain the banner with 2 flails every sequence. And 3, just carry on as you are. Keep the banner and don't change a thing. You'll still have weak sustain and no free crux, but you'll get a little bit of extra ult here and there. I don't necessarily recommend this, but there are some players who won't adapt either because they can't be bothered or they're just suffering from patch fatigue. So long as it kinda works, they'll stick with it. This is why the popular meta is usually a patch or 2 out of date. Which option is best? Well, I did a bunch of testing on the PTS and the live server to measure damage and sustain. The results are not perfect. I used the same basic setup and very simple rotation that many of us might use in content with Null Arca and Tideborn. No Sentinel or anything like that, because that's being nerfed on PTS, so it would throw off our findings. But this is the most accurate comparison I could manage, and it'll do fine. With the old version of Arcanist class mastery on the live server, this setup breaks 147k DPS pretty easily. With Sentinel, it blows way past 150k, which is insane single target damage for such a cleave-heavy setup. And obviously it can go higher and higher if we optimize for the dummy, but that's not really the point of this. We just want a reliable comparison. An identical setup on the PTS only hits 126k, which is a huge loss of damage. A big chunk of that comes out of Fate Carver, since the gaps between beams are so much longer now that we gotta flail twice each time, but I'd say at least half of it also comes from the change to Relentless Focus, which no longer creates a unique boost to weapon and spell damage, but just gives us prophecy and savagery instead. More on that in a minute. Either way, we're looking at a 15% damage loss here, and against multiple targets, that'll be even more. So what if we keep the banner, but lose the class mastery script and slap Cavalier's Charge on there instead? When you do this, you can clearly feel the loss of that free ult from class mastery, but we gain 324 weapon and spell damage from Cavalier's Charge. It's only 80% of the 400 we used to get from Relentless Focus, but that ain't bad. Of course, that only works if you're in 7 medium with Celerity and Quick Cloak or some other source of major expedition. You start taking those away and suddenly Cavalier's Charge might not be worth running. But if you do have those things, this is a noticeable damage increase, up to 130k DPS with that same test setup, which is only 12% behind the previous patch, Still a big loss, and sustain is still pretty shit, but hey, we're regaining some of that lost ground, and that's something. What about if we ditch the banner completely? Sustain immediately becomes way better. It is rough to sustain 2 flails per beam and have the banner running at the same time. A couple of blocks or dodges during the fight and your resources could easily run out. The banner will deactivate and you'll lose damage while it's down, and then again when you have to waste a GCD recasting it. People are even talking about getting their healers to bring back sustain tools like Symphony of Blades and the Master's Resto Staff, and not all of them are joking. Or you can just not run the banner and forego all of those problems. Sure, losing the focus script and that 6% buff to all our direct damage is a big deal. So for that sacrifice to be worth it, we really have to take advantage of all this extra sustain and bar space that we gain from dropping the banner, and claw back some of that lost damage. For a start, we can slot a bunch of Fighters Guild abilities to bump up our stats, and that lets us hit about the same level of damage as if we had kept the banner with class mastery, or even slightly higher, but also with much better sustain. I tested with and without minor heroism because most players will not use heroism potions, but if you do, the damage pulls even further ahead. And if we swap those Fighters Guild abilities for assassination abilities instead, the damage goes up again, only by 1.5% or so, but we'll take it. This is because the Pressure Points passive is slightly stronger than the Fighters Guild Slayer passive, at least in this instance and according to my testing. Again, if you use heroism potions, you'll get even more damage, largely because you can line up your Nightblade ults almost perfectly with off-balance phases if you're paying attention. Again, do not treat these numbers as gospel. There's a bunch of RNG and various factors which can skew the results, but like I said, I used the same simplified setup and rotation for testing each option, and I tested them all multiple times. Another way you could boost your damage without the banner is to use all that extra sustain to switch back to exhausting Fate Carver for longer, stronger beams. So long as you don't mind losing that free shield and making sustain pretty tight again. I actually struggled to sustain the longer, more expensive beam even without the banner. To make that work, I needed something to take pressure off my stamina. Which brings us to the next big change in Update 47, Grim Focus. This is one of the components in the Nightblade's assassination skill line that has made it so freaking dominant during Update 46. But now Zos have stripped this ability of its unique stacking bonus to weapon and spell damage, and put Major Prophecy and Savagery on it instead. I've already been over my thoughts on this change in previous videos. Go check those out if you haven't already, so let's just talk about whether or not you should use it. As I've already shown, there are reasons other than Grim Focus to use the Assassination skill line. That 6.6% crit chance from Master Assassin is very nice if you're flanking. The extra sustain from Executioner or the crit damage from Hemorrhage can both be either needless or amazing. It depends on what you're missing. The ultimate is also great, it's cheap, scales with your DPS, meaning that it becomes more powerful the higher your damage, and the free Ultigen from the Soul Harvest morph is crazy good if you're killing a lot of trash. Then there's Grim Focus. Last patch, we usually morphed it to Relentless Focus and just let it sit on our back bar for free damage stats. That's no longer gonna work. In Update 47, this is only worth slotting if you need the Major Prophecy and Savagery, for the Pressure Points passive, or if you're actually going to cast it. Now, it's definitely worth looking into other skill lines in Update 47. Maybe subclass in a way you haven't tried before. I gotta say, I'm not exactly thrilled with this update, even after the devs backpedaled on some of the bad changes that were initially put forward. But one thing that is kinda nice about Update 47 is that more subclassing combos will be competing in the same ballpark as one another, now that some of the outliers have been reined in. So feel free to ditch Assassination and try something else, but I'd also consider sticking with it and actually firing the Bowproc for a change. We do have space for it, now that it grants Prophecy and Savagery, we can ditch Camo Hunter and slot Resolve instead. That's exactly what I did to take pressure off my stamina, letting me sustain exhausting Fate Carver on a non-banner setup. The Magicomorph Merciless Resolve hits like a truck and does a great job of offsetting the new drain on our stamina that comes from having to flail twice per beam. We can't afford to fire it every 5 seconds, but if we line up our burst correctly, the buff from Soul Harvest or In-Cap Strike lasts 8 seconds and our beam lasts 6 seconds, so we can fire 2 resolves at the start of each burst phase and have both of those and every tick of the beam buffed by 20%. Oh, and by the way, if you prefer a Magicka Arcanist, this also works for that, but you'll probably have to use the Stamina Morph Relentless Focus to take pressure off your Magicka the other way around. Relentless is a little weaker, so you'll be slightly behind the Stamina Arcanists in damage potential, and to be honest, if you want the option of ever using the banner, a Magicka Arcanist is going to be pretty much out of the question in Update 47. 2 flails plus the drain from the banner, sustain just becomes a nightmare. Even on a Stamina Arcanist, the Grim Focus solution is not ideal. The Bowproc from Grim Focus is pure single target damage, which kinda defeats the whole object of using Fate Carver in the first place. But we're only casting 2 every 25 seconds. The beam is still the priority, and Resolve allows us to boost it, letting us use the Exhausting Morph or the banner without wrecking our sustain. And depending on the fight you're in, how much sustain you're getting from supports or from adds dying, and how important it is to focus on a priority target or just cleave everything, you can switch things up on the fly and fire Resolve more frequently or not at all. I personally quite like this rotation. Maybe I'm biased because Nightblade was always my favourite class, but it feels great to actually fire the damn Bowproc again, and to pay attention to your weaving so you make sure you're building it up properly, and frankly anything to break up the monotony of a Fate Carver rotation, which I gotta say is one of the least engaging ones out there. I personally found that the class mastery script made it a little more interesting because it introduced a bit of a wildcard element, a free crux on a timer which never quite lined up with the rotation, which encouraged us to think ahead and optimize our casts around that timer. Not everyone agrees with this, but I thought it made the rotation way more interesting and fun, and now it's gone, I gotta say Arcanist just feels a bit poorer without it. And adding Merciless Resolve back into the mix puts a little more dynamism into the rotation, at least for me. Anyway, there it is. Banner is potentially still worth using even without the free crux, because Minor Heroism and a 6% buff to direct damage are both very nice to have, particularly when cleave damage is a high priority, buffing Fate Carver is a big bonus. Whether it's worth the drop in sustain, well, your mileage is gonna vary. If you're in an organized group, the sustain situation is gonna be a lot better worked out than if you were just pugging with randoms, so it might not be a problem there at all. But I suspect many players who are mainly using the group finder to do dungeons and trials will get fed up with having shitty sustain and will just drop the banner, at least for boss fights. But hey, at least we know there are a couple of ways to claw back some of that lost damage. Assassination or Fighters Guild abilities slotted passively, switching back to exhausting Fate Carver, and using Merciless Resolve actively to boost single target damage and sustain, whether you're still using the banner or not. Let's look at the numbers. Using the banner, scribed with Cavalier's Charge, I was able to get up to 136k DPS on the dummy. And oddly enough, with Class Mastery, I was able to hit up to 138k, which is only 6% behind what we were hitting in Update 46. So Cavalier's Charge came out ahead when I wasn't firing Merciless Resolve, but Class Mastery came out ahead when I was firing it. I honestly don't know if this was a blip, but I tested it a bunch of times and it was consistent. I guess more empowered Bowprocs per minute pushed the single target damage over the top, but the difference is pretty small. If you are going to use Merciless Resolve with the banner, just make sure you've at least got the Magicka Aid passive. That'll help keep your Magicka from running out. Even one skill point in there helps, but ideally you want both levels of this passive, so hey, go do some PvP. That's it for those two, Class Mastery and Grim Focus. Obviously these changes mostly affect you if you're using an Arcanist with Assassination. but the vast majority of PvE damage dealers were doing exactly that last patch. And these are the changes in Update 47 with the biggest ramifications for PvE DPS. But hey, now that the banner is going to be optional in a lot of situations, and with Cavalier's Charge competing pretty closely with Class Mastery, your Fate Carver DD does not have to be an Arcanist anymore, not unless your raid lead specifically wants a Class Mastery banner. So if you have a main character that you'd much rather be bringing everywhere if you can, that's something. And although Fate Carver builds do stand to lose a lot of damage this patch, I think it's fair to say they had power to spare in the first place, and they're still going to be very strong. 138k single target DPS with a cleave setup is still nuts, but at least other subclass options are now not so far behind. I'm hoping to see some more players switch to a Blast Bones rotation, for example, but we'll see what happens. Either way, if you've been using Assassination for the Relentless Focus stacks, those are now gone. So take another look at the passives and see how beneficial they are to you in the content you're playing. If you're not flanking, that first passive goes right out the window for a start. But before you ditch the skill line completely, also consider whether you can fit Merciless Resolve into your rotation. Now the stacks are gone, we're being incentivized to actually cast the skill in PvE, which is fun. And yeah, it hits hard. 4 more things I want to touch on briefly: the Highland, Riptide and Kazpian sets, and Ultigen. Yet there were also changes to things like Dark Cloak and Bound Armaments, but frankly, those are pretty self-explanatory, and it's a matter of personal taste if you use them. They're not exactly having a big impact on the meta right now. So, Highland Sentinel is becoming a much more balanced set, much less exciting, but more generally useful. Again, it's part of that pattern we've seen in Update 47 of nerfing outliers. Basically, you won't be able to reach insane levels of crit chance with this set anymore, but you will be able to max it out much more quickly and easily, so instead of being a set which many players only used on the dummy, it's now a very decent craftable set for general gameplay, even for beginners. Riptide got a similar-ish treatment. It now caps out at 600 weapon and spell damage, rather than the previous value of 740, but it does so much more easily, so long as you're under just 50% of your stamina. With the banner, I think even that is still going to be rough, but if you're not running the banner, your sustain is good enough and cleave is the absolute priority, this is a contender again. I think Null Arca is still stronger for pure single target damage though. One of the gripes people have had with the new trial, Ossian Cage, among other things, is that the sets aren't really worth collecting. We at Ninja Pools are normally flooded with requests for teaching runs and loot runs when a new trial drops. When Sanity's Edge and Lucent Citadel arrived, I was busy for like 3 weeks. But nobody seems to be interested in going to this one. It is very long and quite repetitive, but I'm sure the underwhelming sets are also part of the reason. Anyway, the medium set, Kazpian's Cruel Signet, is getting another refresh, and to be honest, it does look pretty interesting now. To be clear though, against single targets, it straight up sucks. There are no crit lines on it, and it has a line of pen which could be useless depending on your group. The proc isn't that strong and has a 6-second cooldown per target. But as you start to get more targets stacked closely together, and you can hit them all with your AoE direct damage, such as Fate Carver, Biting Jabs, Whirling Blades, you'll start to stack up multiple procs at a time, and that's when the proc damage starts to look a little better. And your character also begins stacking up that 2% damage done multiplier as well. These stacks last 6 seconds, but that timer refreshes every time you gain a new stack. So when people read the tooltip and tell you this set needs at least 6 targets to work, don't listen, they've not understood the tooltip correctly. Even against 3 targets, I was able to get 77% uptime on max stacks. Comparing the performance to Unsul and Null Arca, this was the clear winner against 3 targets, even though the pen line was wasted, and that gap would only grow against 4, 5 or 6 targets. It's not way ahead, but enough to make a difference. So yeah, keep this one in mind. I definitely wouldn't say Kazpian is going to be a must-have set. It's not leaping to the top of the pile or anything, but it is in the mix for sure. Finally, anyone using a subclass setup which takes advantage of multiple Ultigen passives, for example, using Power of the Light alongside Stone Giant to trigger both the Prism and Mountain's Blessing passives at the same time, won't be able to do this anymore. While Zos did scrap the idea to make all of these class Ultigen passives grant minor heroism instead of unique Ultigen, thank fuck, they are still giving them a shared cooldown so we can't stack them up. This wasn't a hugely popular subclassing tactic anyway, so most of us won't even notice the difference, but it'll obviously affect some setups and it is worth knowing about. Reminder that all of these changes go live on Monday the 18th of August. I don't expect any major differences to what I put in this video here, but if there are any, I will update with some corrections. So that's gonna be it for this video. Remember to share it right away, and please support the channel in any way you can. Either here on YouTube, come hang out with us on Twitch, or throw us a few septims on Ko-fi. We need that support to keep going, and we are enormously grateful for it. Thank you. And with that, I wish you good luck in Update 47, keep an eye out for more guides on the way, and hopefully I will see you this weekend on Twitch. Thanks for watching.